this is In Pursuit with Cold Case Clay Bryant and Miss Tony Strickland, my producer. And we're at Rogers Barbecue, our sponsor in Hogansville, Georgia. Today we want to talk about an old Hogansville case. It's the 1970 case of Miss Gwendolyn Moore. And it was the first book that I'd written. And the name of the book is The West Georgia Murder of Gwendolyn Moore, A Cry from the Well.
I'm going to show everybody. I'll get it right there. So you can probably see a little bit better. There it is.
That's this case had a very, very strong reaction from me. And I guess the best way to talk about it is, you know, I was born and raised in Hogansville, Georgia here. My daddy was a police chief for 20 some odd years, and I was for about 12. And but this case went all the way back to my childhood, basically. I say childhood, when I was a teenager. In 1970, I was at the police department with my dad. You know, I've said it several times, and the truth is I was about raised on a civil police car, and right here in Hogansville, Georgia. And my dad, I was there that morning with him, and he got a call from the sheriff's office and said, "Hey, we have a lady that is in a well out on the Mobley Bridge Road, just literally a stone's throw out of the city limits of Hogansville." And they wanted him to go out and take photographs. It was in the photographic period of the Polaroid camera, back before there was any such thing as digital photographs. So he asked me, he said, did I want to go with him? And I did. And when we got to where the call was, it was right there at the intersection of Boyd Road and Mobley Bridge, literally the first house outside the city limits of Hogansville. And it was the Moore house. Actually, it was the Turner's house, and then the Moore's house, and then the Turner's house again. There were three right side by side. And what we found when we got there was the sheriff's office was there, and there were people standing around, and down in the well was you could see the body of Ms. Moore. And the way she landed, I guess, into the well, it looked like she was kind of in a fetal position, or maybe even like she was praying. And they knew she was unresponsive, and they had a wrecker show up, and Ms. Moore was, one of the sheriff's deputies went down on the cable, I guess 20, 25 feet maybe, and put the cable around Ms. Moore, and the wrecker pulled her up. And one of the things I'll never forget was, you know, some things just burn in your memory. And I remember that I was in school with her oldest boy, Alan. Alan was a year younger than me, but I knew him very well. Matter of fact, we didn't live too far from that. We lived on that side of town as well. And when she came up out of that hole in the ground, the cable, you know, when a cable gets tension on it, it'll spin because it's, you know, it's wrapped. And I never will forget seeing Ms. Moore spinning on that cable as she hung over that abandoned well. Everybody knew in the neighborhood over there that the Moore household was not a really happy place. And Ms. Moore had been told that police had been out there several times to domestic situations. This was before the advent of the domestic violence law. And, you know, I guess the best way to describe it was a man's house was his castle. And he ran it pretty much the way he wanted to. And everybody in that around knew that Mr. Moore spared no quarter on Ms. Moore. She, down at Red Barn store, they would tell you that she would come in and she'd be bruised up and whatnot and wearing sunglasses and things like that. And it was just a bad situation. Well, when the sheriff's office investigated the thing. They came up with the fact that the lady fell in the well and she succumbed to her injuries from it. And the sheriff called in the GBI back in the day, before the GBI was like it is now, where they had folks that kind of independently worked cases. Back then, it was a case of the GBI was called and worked at the pleasure of the sheriff. And a lot of times, the outcome was kind of predetermined by what they were given to work with. Well, in this case, that's the way it went. It was a strange thing, though. My involvement, some 33 years later, but every time, as again, my dad would say, he knew the situation and he knew the neighbors and everything that folks had to say. And he also knew the way the water ran around the sheriff's department back in that day. And he, every time he'd see Mr. Moore in town, and on several occasions I'd be with him, I heard him say this: he ought to be on death row in Tattenall County for what he did to that woman. And it was pretty well known that something nefarious had happened to her. And that was my involvement in it. Of course, I knew Alan and his brother, and Larry, I think it was Alan, Larry, no, it was Alan, Ricky, then Larry, and then they had a baby brother that was an infant. But it was just a situation that was left back in my memory. I'll never forget again that lady spinning over that well. That was one of the first really morbid things I'd ever witnessed that just stayed with me. I was about, I guess, 13 at the time.
She looked very young.
Oh, she was. By the time she died, and that picture of her was a picture when she was in middle school at the Margaret Fain Elementary School in West Atlanta. Okay. And I'd gotten that picture from some of her kinfolks, and everybody knew her family and his family knew that they suspected something had happened to her in the midst of a domestic violence episode. But time passed and things went along, and district attorney, I policed most of the rest of my life, and district attorney had an opening for an investigator, and I'd been approached with if I was interested in it, and I went to work for the district attorney's office, I think on the 15th day of October of 2002.
So that was transitioning from the chief of police here in Hogansville to
Right.
that position.
Well, and I had actually, after I left here, I opened a tire store that sold heavy truck tires and forestry tires. And when I sold it, that's when this thing came open with the DA's office, and I went to work for Pete Scandalakis. And Pete was, I can't say enough good things about Pete. He let you do your job. You know, in all situations, that's not the case, but he would. And in this situation, I'd been to work, I think, from the 15th to the 24th. On the 24th, the phone rang, and it was Larry Arrington. He was an investigator at the sheriff's office. And he said, Clay, he said, do you remember a case a long time ago where a lady was in a well outside the city of Hogansville? And I said, miraculously, I guess you'd say. I said, yeah, Larry, not only do I remember it, I was standing there when she got out of the well, and I was, who would have ever dreamed that? He said, well, I have a young lady in my office that she has a death certificate for that little woman, and it's clearly marked homicide, that she had been beaten, and we don't even have a record of it. And he said, I'm gonna send her up to talk to you. And he did. And she came up and she had the death certificate. Well, actually, he faxed the death certificate over to me that morning. And as I stated before, my daddy had some very strong feelings about this case. And when I looked at the date time stamp on the fax, it was October the 24th. It was my daddy's birthday.
Oh my gracious.
It's, you can't make this up.
Mm-mm.
And she came in and told me about, I think it was her grandmother had died, and they were going through her effects, and in doing so, she found this death certificate of an aunt that she never even knew she had.
Wow.
And I got to looking at it, and she wanted some answers as to why the death certificate said one thing and nothing was ever done. So I went to Pete with it, and Pete, of course, did what he always did. He said, sure, if you think it has merit, let's look at it. And we did, and got the old GBI case file, went to archives, and at the Troup County Archives, Miss Kay Minshew, those folks were just, in all my cases, they've just been wonderful. They actually found records from 1970 where the lady was treated at the hospital for injuries that she sustained from domestic violence situations and whatnot. She'd actually received some stitches where she'd been hit in the head with a bottle.
Mm.
And this was a week prior to her death.
Oh my gracious.
And
her children are seeing all this.
Oh yeah. He spared no quarter with them either. Alan, later on, in a short while, he remarried within just a month or so, and maybe a couple of months. But Alan had been, when I spoke to Alan, he said, he said, I've been beat with everything from shoes to swing chains, and the man was just brutal.
Did Alan tell you this while he was in high school?
No, Alan told me this. Well, I kind of get ahead of myself sometimes, but I felt very strongly about, something needed to be done about this case. The justice was not served.
You felt that from the time you was a teenager, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely, because that's what I'd always heard,
Mm-hmm. And your daddy felt that way.
Yeah, absolutely he did. And so I called Alan. I did a little research and found out that what Alan had done was, within just a few months of his mother dying, his dad was beating on him one day, and the neighbors called the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office got there and told him, so son, you got the option of leaving if you want to leave. And Alan, at that point, I think he was 14, and he left walking. And he had an aunt named Scene that lived in LaGrange, and he walked to LaGrange, and Aunt Scene took him in. And he got a little innovative and made a change or two on his birth certificate, and got him a job in the Dixie Cotton Mill.
Wow.
At 14. And to his credit, he went ahead and got him a GED and worked. And as quick as he turned 17, Aunt Scene signed for him as a guardian, and he went in the Navy.
Wow.
And he had a very
long
and successful career in the Navy. And he worked in electronics. He was a submariner. And when he came out, he was over surveillance for the D. Ray James State Prison down in Folkestone, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I found him. And I called him that day and told him that I'd been contacted and that I wanted to look into the death of his mother. And he agreed to meet me, and he wanted it done. Because in situations like this, you know, you need to take the consideration of not only just the crime itself, but the impact it's going to have. Because this was going to open an ugly can of worms for some people, you know. And we met halfway. Met him down around Court Hill on I-75 at a rest area down there. And he related to me the events of that day. That his mother had taken him to the swimming pool. And the father was he didn't like him to have any kind of company. He didn't like him to socialize. And I can only think that's because he didn't want anybody to know what went on in the Moore house. Well, he came home early that day, and when the kids were still at the swimming pool, to speak, all hell broke loose.
Because that's what upset him.
And that's what started.
With something simple like that.
Yeah, it didn't take much to set him off now. But
what was his name?
Ma'am?
What was the man's name?
Marshall Moore.
Marshall Moore.
Mm-hmm.
He had a reputation, didn't he?
He did. He become chummy with some folks on the Grange that ran the vices down there, so to speak. The clubs, there were private clubs back then.
And it's partly run by the Dixie Mafia.
Well, some of the elements were people that had come up from Phoenix City and this and that, and they had
It's a pretty strong hold in this area.
It does. It does. In my book, the first chapter is called "The Snakes Crawl Up the River."
That's true.
And it had to do with those folks. Now, and to be honest, some of those folks out that came from up here went to Phoenix City and got in criminal enterprises down there, and they blossomed. And when they declared martial law, I think it was in '55, the only place in the United States of America that ever been where martial law had been declared.
I know, that's something.
And they indicted, I forget how many, it was like nearly 100 people got indicted, and some for things like murder and organized gambling and things like that. And all those folks kind of got in the wind, and some of them came right back up to LaGrange, and they had a huge influence on the way that in West Central Georgia, the way things were run. They, instead of in Phoenix City, they just did it with brute force and and violence. Up here, they got a little more creative, and they took over the Democratic. Back then it wasn't the Republican Party to speak of at all, but the Troup County Democratic Executive Committee, and they got themselves installed on it, and they controlled the politics of the courthouse.
That's going to be a good story for another day. We're going to dig into the Dixie Mafia.
But anyway.
But he had ties with them.
Yes, and Alan, when I met him that day, he sat there with tears in his eyes, and he told me, he said, the night that my mama, she didn't disappear, she actually went next door and crawled after she suffered a tremendous beating that was witnessed by a neighbor on the other side. It's in the book. I don't want to give it all away.
Yeah.
And he said that he knew that a lot of times when his daddy would beat his mother, and she'd get out of the house for protection, she'd go next door, and the folks next door would hide her in a crawl space under the house. And Alan said that he felt that's probably where she was. And his daddy, when she got out of the house, he got kind of frantic because he didn't want anybody to see what he'd done. And but Alan found her under the house next door at Junior Turner's house. And he said when he crawled under the house, it was the house back then, they were on piers, and but the house had been underpinned, with concrete blocks. And he found her up close to the front of the house where it was starting to get short on the unlevel ground. And he said his mother was sitting there propped up against an old space heater that had been placed under the house. And he said that her nose and mouth was bleeding, her face was swollen. And he said he told his mother, come on, I want you to let's just go, and I'll walk with you. We'll walk to town and see if we can get some help. And she wouldn't do it. She said, no, you got to go back home, And I never will forget. Tears welled up in his eyes. And he said, if I just took my mama by the hand and made her come, that she'd probably be alive. And that boy lived with that for the next 33 years. And we looked at the case, and the problem was the death certificate said all those things, but then the coroner ruled it an accidental death. Back to that, if you own the courthouse, you can get things done. Mm-hmm. And so at that time, I decided there ain't one thing to do. So I called after consulting with Pete. Pete said, we got to have a cause of death that's, that we can fight for. And I said, well, the only thing we could do is exhume the body. We thought probably it was a skull fracture, And I said, well, we can exhume the body. He said, well, let's explore that possibility. So I got with Alan and Gwendolyn's sister. She lived just up into Heard County, and she had known all these things that were going on. And when she had left him a couple of times, and he'd always go back under the threat of, I'm gonna do something to you and the children if you don't come back. And they gave us the okay to exhume her body and do an autopsy. And she's buried right here in Hogansville, Georgia, in the cemetery. And the city crew came out, and the coroner at the time was Jeff Cook. He assisted us in making sure that everything was done the way it was supposed to be done with the exhumation. And we actually got her exhumed that day and took her straight to the crime lab. And we got up there, the pathologist and the anthropologist, Dr. Rick Snow was the anthropologist, and the head of the crime lab, Dr. Sperry, and Dr. Snow, they performed a skeletal autopsy. I've never seen anything. When they finally got the coffin open, the bones were black as ebony. And a lot of people, I didn't know why, and I asked the question. And concrete vaults, they'll fill with water. And because it was in a maintained cemetery, those grass clippings would have tannic acid in them, and it would leach down into the ground and into the water that was in the vault and the coffin, and it literally bleached the bones black.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Well, if you'll notice around your home, oak leaves or pecan leaves, they get in a bucket and the water will turn black. Mm-hmm. And years ago, the Indians used that to dye with.
Well, how about that? That's so new.
and myself and Miss Linda Caldwell, she was one of our prosecutors. She's very, very passionate about cases of like this and children's cases and whatnot. She'd become attached to it as well. And we were there, and they started out, and they had a gurney with the coffin, and then they put another gurney beside it. And Dr. Sperry and Dr. Snow, they would take the skeletal remains out and wash them in a big sink, and they started building their body back on the adjacent gurney. And when he finished with the head, he said her nose had been broken more times than he could count. But he said, I don't see anything that I could say definitively would have killed her. And I mean, at that point, I was just completely devastated. I sat down on the floor, Linda did as well. And we both had tears in our eyes about it because we thought we were at the end of the road. And we sat there for a minute, and Dr. Sperry said, he said something to the fact, he said, this is, I can't remember, he said interesting, or what the term was he used. And he said, no, this is murder. And what he had done, he had started down her cervical spine, and we got to where the hyoid process It's the bony structure that guards the larynx, the voice box. And a manual strangulation, if it is violent, it breaks that. And where the thumbs on each side of the throat will collapse it. And he said, there's no doubt what killed her. He said she was choked to death. Oh. And then dropped in the well. Mm. But we went from the absolute lowest low to a tremendous high. And, you know, it was just, then it was time to go to work, getting statements and that type of thing, and documenting injuries and things that had happened in the past. And
now this is 30-something years.
33.
So Mr. Moore has been running around scot-free, remarried, and the other 3 children had been still left in his care, right?
Well, Ricky, I think, left shortly. I don't know what happened with Ricky, how long he stayed. But now Larry and the younger brother, I think his name was Dean, was the infant. And they didn't never know any better.
Yeah.
You know. And so with, and poor Alan, you know, it just affected him. Like I say, he bore guilt, misplaced guilt. It's nothing he could have done.
Right. He didn't see his mom come out of the well, did he?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's even worse.
One of the saddest things you ever saw, and I remember it explicitly. There were 3 of them. They looked like stair steps on the other side of the well. I don't know. I didn't think about it as much then as I have since I got grown. But they watched their mama spin around on that cable just like I did.
Oh.
It was Alan, Ricky, and Larry. Larry was just a small child. But it was an awful situation.
What about the man? Was he standing there too?
You know, I don't remember seeing him.
I bet he wasn't there.
I don't. Yeah, I don't. I remember them because, you know, I knew them.
Yeah.
Well, I knew Alan and I knew Ricky. And I know Larry to see him, but I didn't. You know. But it was an awful and chilling thing, and we were able to go back, like I said, with the help of relatives, and we kind of constructed the last week, 10 days prior to her death, and documented the fact that she'd been beaten, and it was consistent with everything that we saw in the death certificate originally. And the doctor at the time, that did the pathologist report in LaGrange, the medical examiner, his name was Dr. Joseph Krafka. And usually a death certificate is kind of vanilla, you know. It just says what he sees. In this case, it said that she'd been beaten about the face with fists, that she had stitches that had been put in where she'd been hit in the head with a liquor bottle. I don't know where all that documentation came from. And I never will forget, within just a few days, GBI, his name was Troy Owen, he interviewed Alan. And in Alan's interview, after I got the GBI report, Alan told a story about finding his mother and this and that. And what he told the GBI is, my daddy killed my mama, and if he finds out I'm talking to you, he'll kill me too.
Probably would have.
Well, he knew that he talked to her. You know, he knew that he talked to her, and that's probably one reason that he was so tough on him. Basically, ran him off. But it was just an awful situation. Awful situation. And Marshall came from up in the North Georgia mountains, and he'd gotten in some trouble up there as a kid, and he ended up in West Atlanta, and that's where he met Gwendolyn. Her daddy was a trainman, I think, for the Central Georgia Railroad, and that she was just as completely raised in a different environment than Marshall, you know. But it had not been for lady's name, the niece was Leslie Iannuzzi, and she wanted some answers. To my satisfaction, we got her some. We ended up taking a warrant for murder for Marshall, and the case moved along, and he'd run some health problems, and they put it off and they put it off, and it got kind of apparent there at the end, that early on especially, that they were putting it off by using that. Because I mean, with what we had, to me, I thought we had a very strong case. Undoubtedly they did too. And Judge Keeble said next time he put it off, they supposed to have a surgical procedure, and then come to find out he didn't have it. And they set another trial date, and Judge Keeble said, I don't care if we have to try him on a stretcher. We're gonna hear this case. And it wasn't too long after that he passed away in the hospital.
With cancer?
With cancer. Well, one of the ladies, a phlebotomist that was working there, I think a phlebotomist, this lady was a nurse, and she said that he got to where he would refuse his feeding and so forth, and basically starved himself.
Yeah, he just didn't want to go to prison. He just wanted to die instead of going to prison.
Well,
and that wasn't a pleasant way to die either.
No.
Mm-mm.
No.
So justice was inadvertently served in a way, but not like most people would have wanted.
Well, I would have loved to have seen the case be tried, but that wasn't. At least we got to speak for her.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she. That's one thing that I dearly love about doing what I'm doing, is that these people don't get a chance to speak for themselves. And in this case, 33 years later, everything's forgotten and swept away and under the rug, and it was just, considering that my dad's opinion, and on his birthday it comes back, some things just meant to be.
Yeah, it was. It was.
So that's how we got where we were with Ms. Moore.
Yes.
And it was, I'd come home at night and I couldn't sleep because I'd talk to the family, and you know all the things that she'd endured, and it'd just be on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, for whatever reason, and I'll never understand why, but I would just sit down and start writing about home and here and my dad and the way I've always been taught to think and act, and then the things that meant a lot to me.
Yes.
And then about the case and how it progressed, and usually most people that write true crime, they're third-party people that do it off reports, and they go do interviews. And that's one thing about the books that I've written, is I lived them, and that puts it translates to the page well.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a lot of fluff and opinion in them. That's just the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been able to, I think, speak for some folks that needed their story told.
Hey, amen to that. I want to read again. The name of the book is Solving the West Georgia Murder of Gwendolyn Moore, A Cry from the Well. And tell them where they can get this book.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, CVS has them in certain CVS stores. And locally, you can get it at Pretty Good Books on LaGrange. They've been so very nice to me in promoting my books and helping when they had signings and so forth. And they also keep copies of them at Gordon's Hardware locations in LaGrange. But you can get them, and just that book in particular was the first one that went under contract to be in an audiobook form. So, but it's a tragic story. It's a sad story, but it's a story that needed to be told. And every chapter ends with that voice in the well.
Yes, y'all. I got the book right after it went out, right after it was published. I was going to a conference in Savannah, Georgia, and I couldn't put it down. I didn't go to like dinners, and I'd eat breakfast in my room anytime in between my conference meetings. I did not put this book down till I finished it. It is riveting. I mean, I know this podcast kind of tells it more personally, which is great. It's great to hear this. But you need to read the book to get all the details in there. It is awesome. And I read it within a day. But that's because I was just like, I had to know. I mean, I had to know. But y'all take it. It's real. It's a good book. So y'all try to get a hold of it wherever you can. If you can't, just call me, and I've done that. People call me and say, I want Clay's book, and then I call Clay and get it for him, and meet, because this is such a wonderful book. We'd like to get it out to everyone, and if you can get it on Audible or listen to it through, is it Audible?
It's not out yet on audio. It's just signed a contract on it just a few days ago.
So it'll be on a audio platform soon, and we will let y'all know when that happens. But man,
it's been chronicled on, good Lord, podcasts all over the country, and one or two that are in Canada, and the last one was a couple of weeks ago. Brian Morris out of New Orleans has a podcast, and he's done all three of my books, and I'd like to say thank him, and Cheryl McCollum in Atlanta with Zone 7, and he's just a lot of them.
And you can find these other podcasts in the content part of this podcast, so that you can go back and listen to some of the interviews that Clay's done on all these other places. Just excellent people, excellent podcasts. We'd like to give shout outs to them. Zone 7, particularly out of Atlanta. But anyway, we enjoy doing this, and I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. I think it's one of the most personable ones that you'll ever get out of Clay, because to me, it's like the beginning of his career, and he didn't even know it. So,
and I can't say, how much I appreciate what you're doing. I mean, Hogansville, Georgia is my home, and it's there were stories to tell about it, and I like to think that the way that I think and the way that my career in life has gone was directed by this little town here in West Georgia.
It's true.
People.
Good and bad.
Good and bad.
Yes, that's
Just
the way it goes
just
with
as
the
bad
community.
as some folks where there were people that were much, much better.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I've been blessed. And I don't know if I said this in the last podcast or not, but that book stayed on the shelf for nearly 20 years. I just wrote it, and it was in a 3-wing binder sitting on a shelf, and went to a dove shoot actually, and Dr. John Williams was there, and he was the creative writing guy at LaGrange College.
Oh, I know John, yeah.
And he had written a book about the jazz culture in Atlanta, Georgia, and he would do workshops on how to get works published and whatnot. And he was talking about his book, and we were sitting there, and I was actually trying to be halfway funny, and I said, "Shoot, Doc." That's exactly what I said. But I said, "I wrote a book," and he said, "Well, I'd love to read it, Clay." And I thought, he's just trying to be nice. And before we left that day, he said, I'd like to read your book. And I got it to him, and within a few days, he called me and said, "Clay, have you ever thought about getting this published?" I said, "No, sir, I don't know anything about it." He said, "Well, I do." And he said, "Would you mind if I submit it somewhere?" I said, "Sure." And my first thing, I thought it was that he was talking about a vanity press where you'd have to pay to get it printed. And he said, "No, I think somebody will take this." And he said, "The story's great." And in a few days, the folks from the History Press, where he'd have submitted it to Arcadia, and one of the biggest publishing companies in the country, the History Press called me and said, "Hey, Mr. Bryant, we would like to do your book." Mm-hmm. And since then, they've done 2 more books, and I'm writing on a 4th one now. And now that I've gone back to doing this again after I retired, I've already run into one case is finding a resolution, and just started on another one.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll have about a half dozen if I last that long.
And Dr. Williams won a literary award this past week.
He
He's
did.
been
He did.
highly honored. He's a fabulous person. I love him. He's so nice to be around.
Oh, he's one of the most pleasant men you'd ever meet. He's edited every book for me, and it never cost me a dime. And every time I'd have some kind of public forum, and he'd always come, and he's been wonderful, you know.
Yes, he's a really, and he loves history too, so
Oh,
that makes it really
he's a
even
brilliant
better.
man.
Yeah.
I enjoy him so much. He's been very, very kind to me.
Another thing you mentioned is the Troup County Archives and the Historical Society. I sat on the board for them for years, and they're lovely people, but if anybody out there wants to do research on things, especially if their family members are from Troup County, that's the place to go.
I had on one of the cases that I worked, it was a young girl. She was kidnapped, and her body was found 2 years later tied to a tree down in Harris County, Georgia. And when I actually started doing the research on that case, we ended up convicting the guy. He ended up being a serial rapist murderer.
You're going to tell about that later.
We'll get to that one. And, but during the archives helping with the case, we found another case that had been unsolved since the 87. An unsolved case that we indicted him on, as well as the murder case, but we indicted him in Meriwether County because he had taken that victim from down in the valley, or from West Point up to Stovall, where he attacked her.
It's scary. It's too close to home to have a serial killer.
But the only thing that, the only reason that case was brought to light and that woman was able to tell her story was because of the folks at Troup County
Archives, man, that's in downtown LaGrange, y'all. Y'all get a chance to go down there.
Oh,
Fabulous. And the museum of the history of Troup County is fabulous too.
It is. I mean, and like I say, in the Moore case, they found medical documents for me from 1970. And who in God's name would have ever thought that?
Mm-hmm.
And the sheriff's department didn't have any record of a murder, but they had where the guy put stitches in the lady's head a week before he killed her.
Isn't that great? It's great.
Insane.
Well, y'all, it's been a pleasure being with you today, and we will sign off until the next episode. Y'all have a great week.
And do remember, Rogers Barbecue, Hogansville, Georgia, is our sponsor. They've
Yes.
got some fine barbecue and catfish.
Thank you.
What do you think?